Hello, happy Friday. Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephanie Kissinger, and I'm the head of community here at Evolution. And we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes with our Evolutionary Leadership Foundation. We're going to give it another minute or so here, and then we'll get started. We'll let a few more people kind of trickle in. Happy Friday to those of you just joining us. We're going to get started with Evolutionary Leadership Foundation series very soon.
All right, welcome everyone. I'm sorry that I wasn't in the last session with you. I'm glad to be back. So as we usually do, we invite you to consider this time as a bit of a short retreat in the midst of your day and at the end of your week. And you're welcome to listen to this as a podcast style if you want to walk or be outside or sitting, however it works for you. And as we often do, let's start with just a bit of settling and presencing. Again, kind of taking a moment from whatever you were doing in the past. If you want, you can close your eyes. If you're walking, you can just bring your awareness to your feet as they touch the earth or whatever you're doing, the movement of your body. Bring your attention to your breath as it moves in and out. And wherever you are, bring your attention to the space above you. Sometimes we might call that the energy of heaven, the expansive, spacious, kind of upward energy. We could even say a transcendent energy. And then bring your awareness to the space below you, the earth, the immanent. And notice how your body, your physical body, in a way connects that expansive, transcendent energy of space above you and the immanent, solid, present energy below you. And in Eastern traditions, it's said that human connects heaven and earth in our natural physical form. And as you bring your present awareness to your body and your space, we invite you to use the chat to just check in briefly. It could be a single word or few words. How are you showing up today? What are you present to? Just so we can get a sense of the community. So if you'd like, go ahead and in the chat.
It looks like it's disabled.
Oh, okay. I was wondering.
Apologies, Stephanie. Can you toggle that on.
Well, hopefully we'll see how people are feeling. So if that comes on, feel free to check in there. And let's just orient to where we are in this Evolution Leadership Foundation's journey. So let's take a look at that. Just looking at the chat. So we are now in session 7, Wisdom of Spirit and Soul. So kind of the narrative arc that we've been on has been just some basic foundational models of how we think about leadership and leadership development, the kind of frameworks of human development and evolution, spiral dynamics, integral theory, the importance of self-awareness for leaders, the power of mindfulness and meditation, partially to bring self-awareness, but also to connect us to something perhaps bigger and transegoic, transpersonal with us. We talked about the shadow and how important it is to own and be aware of those aspects of ourselves that we hide, repress, and deny. They have a tendency to show up in less effective ways in our leadership and in our relationships. So having a connection to that, and also recognizing the wisdom and power that may be in some of those aspects of ourselves. I wasn't able to join you last time, but the importance of executive leadership and presence, which is a very embodied presence and connection. And today we're going to talk about something we don't usually talk about in business contexts or, professional contexts, but it's kind of core to how we at Evolution think about leadership and work with our clients, sometimes explicitly, sometimes it's kind of more subtle and just in the field of how we work, which is the wisdom of spirit and soul. And one of the ways that we work a lot with early stage startup founders, leaders, it's a pretty chaotic, intense situation. There's a lot of money on the table. There's a lot of power. There's a lot of hope. There's a lot of fear. And one of the ways that I think about that world, and one of the reasons I'm attracted to working in it, is I think of it as a bit of the alchemical vessel for the soul. It's so intense and so hot that should one decide this journey of leadership, or this certainly the journey of founders or founding a company, but the journey of leadership in general can very much be an alchemical vessel for the wisdom of our soul and our spirit, and can become almost a spiritual and personal journey because of that intensity. It's like how steel gets stronger tempered by fire. So part of that in the wisdom of spirit and soul is a little bit with like the meditation I just mentioned or walked us through, which is this kind of transcendent inherent drive that we hold, that humans have, just like a drive for food and sleep and procreation. There's kind of an inherent biological, conscious or even unconscious drive that humans have. And part of our view is that there's an inherent drive in human beings to self-transcend. And we can see that in all the spiritual and religious traditions of the world, but also explorations of things like ecstatic dance or really intense sports or rock climbing or whatever it is, where there's this kind of drive to transcend that normal everyday consciousness that we associate with our personalities and our ego, and kind of can make us crazy, with which we looked at with mindfulness a little bit, of the way our thoughts. So when we talk about spirit, there's this sort of transcendent drive and quality, a kind of an upward drive. And when we think about soul, there's kind of an immanent depth quality to being a human being. And our view is that those are important aspects of ourselves to embrace, to understand, to be conscious of, to bring consciousness to, perhaps intentionality to. And that as leaders do that, they are not only more effective, but wiser and arguably happier human beings. So that's a bit what this session is. And like I said, we don't usually talk about this sort of thing in business and in our professional lives, but our point of view is that it's actually quite critical. So Matt, I don't know if you want to say anything more about where we are in that journey or anything I just said.
Yeah, and then maybe transition to a little bit of context. This is the penultimate session. We're kind of like peaking here before we land with like being actionable in the world and living well, and business being kind of a force for good, right? Which is kind of the impact point. And we really talk about leadership as a spiritual journey quite a bit, especially a lot internally. And it's part of our deep core and one of the differentiators for how we see the world. Most leadership models are based off of social psychology, or behavioral, psychology as well, motivation, doing things different, understanding influence, right? All of those things are really important in leadership. But the thing that compels us really is about the core of the human experience, ways of optimizing and actualizing ourselves that just transcend pure behavior, and looking at who we are and why we're here, and understanding that business is just one of many contexts that we choose to live. And for those of us that are practicing either as leaders or coaches, we just understand that this domain deserves its own evolution. And we believe in evolution as our primary thesis. And the way it's articulating in the majority of our work right now is through business. And we believe that business is, in some ways, the front lines, if you think of the global impacts as a way to practice. And the more people, as Ken Wilber says, we can get to second tier, the more people faster we can get to green from spiral dynamics and second tier, the greater chance we have to truly evolve our planet and maybe even save it. And so this is our place of practice. We wear this, and especially now, something, and just being kind of open about how we see things, and really looking at spirituality and soul, or spirit and soul, as two different elements of the human experience that speak to the quiet part of leadership. So part of this, we think of leaders that are fully engaged and leaders that have followerships and are influential, especially across hundreds and thousands of people. They're deeply connected to their own vitality and their own feelings of being alive. They know why they exist. Every part of their cell vibrates. They walk into the room. We talked about this with presence. There's a magnetism. And once we are awakened to that and realize the miracle of this moment, of being alive, of the gift that life is, and we're connected to something that is greater than ourselves, it enlivens our body. And that is part of the magic of what creates influence, like a depth of influence in a lot of leaders. The other thing is just this concept of being a spiritual warrior, that in the face of great problems, we're going into battle, but the battle does not exist with others, or certainly outside of ourselves. The battle is within. And in that place, we can be brave and on our edge and doing well in the world, and at the same time, living the spirit of human values and standing for global consciousness. And so this path of the warrior, this path of spiritual development, of soul development, really is a noble one. And leadership development is just one of many excuses to develop ourselves. So we talk about span and we talk about depth. And one of the things when we think about spirit versus soul, it is really that Y axis, the depth axis. And depth can mean two different things. If we think about the above kind of, the above, it's a sense of spirit, a sense of transcendence, maybe even connection to something greater, connection to purpose and what is really meaningful and maybe compelling about something that is beyond ourselves, that pulls us forward, where we feel in greater concert with the universe. There's a sense of freedom and possibility and openness. If you think of being out in nature and sitting on a rock on top of a hill or a mountain and looking out over a forest and having those flashes of insight around the nature of things and what you're called to do in the world, given that, it's a really powerful way of looking at life itself. And it's one of those core things for every human, just like food and water, and connection and relationship. A spiritual life, which means these things, is really important. And we know from Blue Zones research, for those of you who are familiar with that, people that in pockets of the world that live until they're, centenarians, one of the dimensions that they figured out is that people have a spiritual life. It literally keeps us alive. Spiritual practice, the community aspect that comes with it, and something that pulls us outside of ourselves and up. Similarly, down, depth has to do with eminence, the nature of our humanity, our soulfulness, meaning which lives in the body, a sense of connection to ourselves and others, and artistry and expression and authenticity, a sense that when we talk about shadow or our own psyche, these are all qualities of depth that live, as we would say, in a sense of soulfulness. And if you think of when you say that person is really soulful, and you break that down a little bit, look at some of these words. That's generally what we're feeling from the other person, a warm-hearted, authentic, connective, expressive sense of being in their body, right? That's how we describe somebody as soulful. And these are two fundamentally different things when we're coaching people. We're coaching people towards purpose. We're coaching people towards quiet and spiritual principle, and we're coaching them into their feelings, into their right brain and narrative and design and symbolism and their body and how that shows up, a sense of artistry in their work, in their craft. And they're two distinct buckets to optimize in leadership development. And we're going to talk about both of those today just a little bit. And as we go through it, I encourage you to just journal. And there's going to be some concepts here, kind of more discussion based, that you can really ask for yourself. You may already be entertaining the question of deep purpose, or who you are, or what deserves expression right now in your life, what you're connected to or not, or where you could bring art to what you do or who you are. So this is our exploration today. So Janet, do you have anything to say about kind of that intro? Otherwise, I'm going to ask you, what does spirit and spirituality mean in terms of what we're talking about today in leadership?
Yeah, nothing by way of intro, but when I think about spirituality, there's a few different things about that. One of the things I think about is, as I mentioned, and as Matt is kind of also talking about, this inherent drive that humans have to transcend themselves. And people may not necessarily use that language or even that framing, but if we look at even just this everyday kind of consciousness that's busy, often we have kind of monkey mind or anxiety or whatever, that sort of thing. Most of us want to not be in that. And that, I think, is this inherent wisdom that's wanting to come through the human being into something that's just beyond me. And when we talked about earlier in the sessions, I can't remember if it was session 1 or session 2, around kind of some of our fundamental models and frameworks that we use, we talked about human development and the development of the stages of cognitive development, moral development, kind of moving from being, an infant into being an adult and developing those ego strengths of presence and cognitive development, just natural human development. And part of the posit here is that there is this drive to be trans-egoic, transpersonal, to go from being egocentric, which actually is quite contracted, and from a leadership perspective also can be quite problematic or can reduce trust, to actually becoming world-centric. So there is actual real application. I was just in an offsite yesterday thinking about this quite a bit, of that kind of sense of self or self-protection, or protecting my function, or protecting that kind of contracted state is not only not particularly effective in a leadership situation or even a team situation, it's also quite unpleasant. And so part of this notion of spirit or spirituality is that transcendence of that, which does create this sense of freedom that I also want to touch upon. There's a concept that I learned through the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, but I'm sure it exists in many of the world's great wisdom traditions, which is a quality of unconditional confidence. And that's something I work a lot with leaders on, is cultivating a sense of confidence and presence and immanence in a room that is completely independent of any conditions that are going on around. So it doesn't matter what political situation's going on, what market conditions are going on. None of that matters. There's a quality of unconditional confidence that is available to human beings. And this image that Matt has just put up is, of course, the Buddha. And if you see, if you've noticed, there's different mudras or postures that you'll see. Sometimes it's the Buddha with his hands kind of resting in his lap. Sometimes there's the big fat laughing Buddha that you sometimes will see in Chinese restaurants next to the toothpicks. So there's many different manifestations of this wisdom energy that the Buddha just is a representation of. This particular one, you'll see that the Buddha is touching the earth. And the story here is that after a very long and arduous journey of starvation and, really looking for, quote, the truth, the Buddha sat down under a tree with this deep commitment, like, I'm going to sit under this tree until I wake up, until I understand the nature of my mind and the nature of suffering, and just sat with this resolve. And all these demons, inner demons, outer demons, kind of plagued him. And then at a certain moment, there was this awakening and this precise clarity of seeing through it all. And in that moment, he had this insight of, with this great awakening and insight, but also this sense of, if I try to explain this to anyone, nobody's going to know what I'm talking about. Nobody's going to believe me. No one's going to understand. And so in that moment, he touched the earth and said, the earth is my witness, meaning I don't need any external validation, or I don't need any of these other conditioned situations to deeply know and trust this inherent wisdom that, that has emerged. And so that confidence comes from that place. The unconditional confidence comes from a sense of wisdom, of self-transcendence, of seeing through constructs, and all of that. And that is, we could say, in the realm of spirituality. It's transcending ego, it's transcending form, it's transcending all of the, if we bring it back kind of to business context or whatever, it's transcending all of the politics, the coalition building, the confusion, the trade-offs, like all of that stuff. It's almost like it can kind of evaporate into spacious awareness and wisdom, from which place one can act. So it's not just spacing out and whatever, being ungrounded. There's a quality of clarity and precision and confidence that comes from that. And who doesn't want that? So when I coach people and leaders around this, and I mention even that term, unconditional confidence, like, I want that. So that becomes part of their personal journey. We can say spiritual journey, coaching journey, leadership journey, whatever. The other thing when I think about spirituality in leadership and in business or whatever, just in our lives, is the mystical experience. And mystical experience actually has been defined and has qualities that many of us have experienced with or without practice, or with or without even intention, or with or without even identifying as I'm a seeker. A mystical experience is, and it can be momentary, it can be drawn out. Apparently, if you're enlightened, it's like all the time. But the qualities of mystical experience are, number one, a sense of sort of dissolution of self. So all that, like, I am Janet and I've got these things on my mind, and what about that thing that happened yesterday? Just like kind of all that noise dissolves. So there is no self for a moment. There's a quality of connection. That's really important. So this is the transpersonal, trans being beyond, but also trans being across. And so that deep sense of connection to others, to plants, animals, space, elements, the cosmos itself, mystical experiences are marked by that, where there's a sense of deep connection, again, without doubt. And another, I guess the third or a third aspect of a mystical experience is this sense of deep love and compassion. So I don't know if any of you have ever had that experience. You could put in the chat of yes, no, you don't have to, but I'm very curious, because many people have had that just kind of spontaneously. Sometimes, the classic almost cliche is that happens in nature. But it could happen when you're washing the dishes or brushing your teeth or, sitting in traffic, whatever, that there's this. And that's what we mean when we say that this is an inherent capacity of human beings. It's one of the blessings we could say of being a human being, is we have that capacity. So knowing that, or holding that frame, is something that we certainly at Evolution hold for leadership, that is an inherent drive, it's an inherent capacity. It can be cultivated through different practices. Psychedelics have become kind of more mainstream talked about. There's a four-part series on Netflix called How to Change Your Mind with Michael Pollan. He talks about some of these things, and this is not necessarily advocating psychedelics. It's simply observing that in the culture that has become more of a thing that people are thinking about. And I would argue that it's because there is this inherent drive to self-transcend, and that is potentially one path. But there are many, and like I said, they sometimes happen spontaneously. So linking that to, again, leadership, when a leader is healed from a kind of psychological perspective and integrated the shadow and the pain or whatever's happened in one's life, when a leader is connected to something greater than themselves and a spaciousness, which is what we're talking about today, there's a presence, an unconditional confidence, a wisdom that can be channeled in the most ridiculous and difficult and chaotic of situations that is palpable. And again, part of this discussion today is also the imminent or eminent quality of that, of soulfulness. So I'll pause there. That's what I have to say about that for now.
Yeah, one thing that I would certainly add to that is many times in personal development and coaching, when we're working with people, there is a limit to the mind and thinking and even feelings. And there becomes a moment where we can transcend all of that and not feel peaceful, but get incredible perspective. And so much of the technology around coaching and personal development has been around working with, you think of cognitive behavioral therapy, and you think of reward systems, and you think of even just like changing our narratives inside and connecting them to feelings and EQ and all of that. It's a very intrapersonal body of work. And what Janice is talking about is having, experiences where we kind of transcend ourselves, and how powerful and good that is for people. It doesn't mean that you can escape doing the work of your own humanity, but it is really an extra and supercharger in terms of our own development as humans.
Yeah, I want to speak to this slide as well. One of the other things that I personally end up coaching quite a bit of with people is when you are connected to some kind of greater source of wisdom. Some people might call that God. Some people won't call it God, but there is this self-transcendent, beyond the personal, beyond the ego, wisdom space that when one is connected to that, one can manifest in whatever form is useful in that moment. So the image that's on the screen right now is a Dakini image, which comes from the Tibetan tradition, which translates to sky dancer. And for the Star Wars nerds in the world, the surname Skywalker apparently has come from this archetype and this tradition. And a Dakini is a being, often female in form, but not necessarily, who is seen dancing in the sky. There's no ground underneath them, and they are potent energies of wisdom. And sometimes in the iconography, you'll see a form that's very fierce. And sometimes you'll see a form that is very gentle and kind. So like white Tara in the Tibetan tradition is very calm and gentle and kind, kind of like Mother Mary as an archetype. Sometimes you'll see a form that is quite fierce with swords and fire. Sometimes you'll see ones like the one that's on the screen right now that's kind of caring and carefree. And what I will work with clients on is that when you can access those different types of energy, you can manifest as a leader in whatever form is most useful in that moment. You can think of it as a kind of transpersonal version of situational leadership. So sometimes what's needed is a really compassionate, open, caring presence. Sometimes it's very precise, very directive, very clear, and sometimes wrathful. And the discernment and wisdom of great leadership is to be able to manifest in the moment as needed in a way that is skillful and present. And I think my point of view, and perhaps our point of view, is that that is available when we have transcended self, when it's not about our kind of contracted personal sense of being, but that there are these wisdom archetypes that are available to humans that are arguably universal that we can then tap into and manifest as leaders as needed.
Yeah, the other thing that happens is we have these realizations, and you can think of, we're having a conversation about spirituality, not religion, but you can think of other traditions, including Western-based traditions, where the realization of God, if you think of Christianity, as Janet says, when you have that, experience, it gives you both the connection and sense of freedom and love that instructs you how to live. And so much of the time when people find spirituality, they invert it and they find, a fundamentalist code of ethics, and really the commandments, the precepts, you can think of those different kind of constructs. They come from a profound place of awakening and insight. And once you've had that, they live through you in an authentic way that's quite powerful versus gripping onto them like some moralistic code, which is, one of the big misunderstandings. But it really is the spine of being, of living in this world that really anchors a higher order of awareness. That's one of the ways to kind of think about them. And so, these things, connecting purpose and kind of values, really start to kind of create this bridge, as Janet said, of heaven and earth. And maybe, what we can do before we transition into the earth is just look at some questions that relate to this concept. So if you think of the basic foundation of spiritual development, these questions are some of many that may activate, may incite some things for you to look at. And one of the best things we can do if we're interested in this kind of work is go to a retreat by spending time alone, working with teachers, having a process or a container that supports us not only in insight, but in inquiry. That allows kind of that like deeper and self-transcendent thinking to come alive.
So Matt, let's read those for anyone who may not be looking at the screen.
Sure. Where do I find meaning? What is my higher calling? Where do I feel deeply present and connected to something greater than myself? How should I live well? How do I connect to the great mystery and use it to motivate and inspire? So you might, again, find some insight in these or more. And we're certainly advocating for this level of inquiry. And we're also advocating for you to have a set of practices or a practice that you do sometimes at the same time every week, every day and every week. If you're able to find a space either outside or where you live, your kind of body knows that it's going into the practice space, and you're doing contemplative practices, you're journaling, you're doing prayer, reading. Sometimes people go outside, as Janet says, and the ritual as well of being in community with other people in practice is also a really powerful way to gain insight as you're with other humans. Part of spirituality is this drive for us as a species to come together and find insight, and that can come in a coaching circle, but by the way, or going to a service somewhere. So we certainly encourage regular retreats, an active part of practice. If you think of the different lines: physical, mental, emotional, etc. Spiritual health and development is its own line of development that requires active practice daily and weekly. Okay, any questions or final comments, Janet, before we kind of pivot into the other side?
No, let's do it.
When we talk about soul, we start to bring ourselves down into the things of the body and the matters of the body. We think of this earthy, mossy, dirt, fertile elements of the soul. And we know kind of from soul-centered psychology that from the ashes and the dirt of our life springs forth our vitality and who we are. And again, we fall into ashes and come alive. And the inquiry into who we are and things like expression and narrative and feeling, those kind of things really are powerful. And when we watch leaders, especially go from early stage focusing purely on a product to leading thousands sometimes of humans, many of them have this profound realization as they look at their calendar and it's filled up with supporting people in one-on-ones, or it's empty and they're not doing anything technical anymore. They're giving speeches, as we say. They realize that the human element and the web of people and sending ripples of feeling and inspiring people, we know, that inquiry is deeply soulful. And that's why higher order elements of leadership, when you make it to the top of an organization or you're leading, it happens fairly quickly. A group of people, things like vision and how you express yourself, people being able to connect to who you are, your ability to tell stories and use things like metaphor and design in the craft of your leadership, makes the ripple effect of your influence powerful, especially if it's connected to a higher purpose. But it's not easy because it brings us into the territory of our deep psyche. It brings us into the territory of our emotions, and looking at the mythology and the stories that govern our lives. A couple of foundational pieces, we think about soulful and soul-centered psychology. Certainly James Hillman is one of the most noted, wrote a book called Revisioning Psychotherapy, and really took issue with the empirical quantitative roots of therapy. There's one of the quotes that says, what have we gotten, or where have we gotten in 100 years of therapy, which is kind of an indictment of reducing humans to an objective frame, which had been happening. So Hillman, the whole school at Pacifica, we've talked about Joseph Campbell, who talks about myths and why we connect to myths. We've talked about Jung, that also has a sense of the transpersonal, but it's less out into the universe, and it's more, as Janet said, to the side, that there's a great transpersonal connection in all humans. That's a very soulful inquiry when we think about that. And one of my favorite books, not necessarily as well known from the mid-90s, is Care of the Soul by Thomas More. And he talks about soul-centered living. Really, the mid-90s was like, in some ways, a peak or zenith of soul-centered psychology. It's fallen a little out of vogue, but the elements of it are still really beautiful and instructive for leadership and personal development. John O'Donohue from Ireland, he wrote many beautiful books, including Anam Cara, for those of you that have read that, intersection of Celtic tradition and Christianity. I'm just going to read this as a kind of element. He was like definitely part of the soul-centered movement in that era. So this piece is called For a New Beginning. In out of the way places of the heart where your thoughts never think to wander, this beginning has been quietly forming, waiting until you are ready to emerge. For a long time as I watched your desire, feeling the emptiness growing inside of you, knowing how you willed yourself on, still unable to leave what you had outgrown. It watched you play with the seduction of safety and the gray promises that sameness whispered, heard the waves of turmoil rise and relent, wondered, would you always live like this? Then the delight when your courage kindled and you stepped onto new ground, your eyes young again with energy and dream, a path of plenitude opening before you. Though your destination is not clear, you can trust the promise of this opening. Unfurl yourself into the grace of beginning that is at one with your life's desire. Awaken your spirit to adventure, hold nothing back, learn to find ease and risk. Soon you will be home in a new rhythm, for your soul senses the world that awaits you. So even, when we think of these poems and these kind of traditions, poetry itself is a soul-focused endeavor. It expresses things that prose and language sometimes fail because it's somewhat abstract. It speaks to a part of the depth of the human experience. And one of the things, when we think and we start to break this down is when we explore who we are, we find different qualities of ourselves. We find these different parts. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about shadow, that live in exile, things that we want, lives that we would want to live, beliefs that are not quite as nice to look at. things that are critical or jealous or competitive or full of shame. And when we, kind of get our hands into the dirt and unearth those things, again, if you remember, the fingers become a fist and we make ourselves more whole. In this drive for integration, we become a more whole person. And in our wholeness, we're able to lead people because people are following at a very subtle level the integration of a leader. And that sometimes means finding things that aren't so nice to look at. And if you think of, this image that talks about a very archetypal image, when we go down into our roots, there is a paradox that it brings us up into insight. And so that point of insight from the spirit and the soul, there is a mingling that happens, and we think it's really quite powerful. And that's one of the ways where you can't escape your mind and you can't escape the universe, as I previously said. These are Jung's core archetypes. There's many archetypes. He looked across different traditions, and in his therapy practice that, as we all know, grew out of Freud, he looked at these constructs, these primordial images that exist in dreams that would arise in moments of where the subconscious could arise. And they also exist, as Joseph Campbell, who was a friend of Jung at one point in their career, talked about live in myth and story. And so we can find these different parts of ourselves when we inquire within that sometimes are surprising. The part of us that is seductive, the part of us that is rebellious, can create magic. The part of ourselves that beyond our duty is innocent, or even young. And this is where things like journaling or doing therapy or unpacking something that happened that surprised us in our day, it brings us kind of into our depths. And in that kind of qualities, it evokes a part of ourself that has something that it can really be instructive for our own development. And so we think about these questions about soul similarly to spirit, and you might journal these as well. There's certainly more, but when we think about soulfulness, we ask things like, what's the story that I've been living? What's the new story that I want to live? What exists deep inside of me? It's just, that question is broad, but we can take that many different places. Who am I? Great exercise, by the way, to ask yourself that question and journal for 5 minutes. You have to fill up the page for 5 minutes. It's interesting what you find. For many of us, especially that live in the technical world or have lived building process and companies, this question of like, what feelings do I have and where do they live in me? And then there's a sub that says, how can I express them in a way that connects me to other people or fills my life? How can I express my authentic self? Embedded in that is, who am I? And then authentically, how can I live in a way where how I show up, where what's on my desk, the choices I make in a moment-to-moment basis, what I write, every moment is an opportunity to express who we are. And first we have to really know who we are, but the sense of expression, and we think of people again that are soulful, there's generally a kind of warm, resonant quality of authenticity that comes out of them. And that's certainly something for a leader that creates powerful followership. I love this question. How can I make what I do art? How is what I do poetry? We generally don't ask that question candidly, especially early in a coaching engagement, but it's always there. And there'll be quiet moments in coaching where a leader is really understanding the artistry and the craft that is going into what they're doing. And craftspersonship is just another word for creating art. It is a sense of love, even if it's a UI or UX or a product focused decision, or even leading a team. Great leaders look at a team and they think about it like a concert or a live experiential art piece. And the great leaders that we work with are able to really work with that part of our brain, because the limbic system is what motivates behavior, and our social neurons fire with other humans, and we connect via emotions, and understanding ourselves and how to express them in a way is really quite powerful. Very, very hard. Only takes really a lifetime of understanding and then trial. This last question is, how can I feel and express love in my work? Now, you might say, what role does love have in business or leadership? And as we say that word, we don't certainly mean romantic love, although that happens. People meet people at work. It really has to do with that, as Janet says, that deep human and even global mindset that looks at the dignity of all life and says that the exchange of love really is all there is in humans, whether we're leading towards common cause in a business, whether we're in a family or a friendship. And that if we conducted and included love as a part of a leader's toolkit, we also think that that is one of the powerful and transformational aspects of leadership, those leaders that are kind of lauded, not only just for the great things that they do, but people that stand up and say, you changed the course of my career, you changed my life. I remember 20 years ago working for you and the impact that had on me. That is a profound sense of love, and the ripple effect that a leader can have on their team arguably is one of the greatest influences on an adult's life. And so coming from that place, again, hopefully realized from spirit, that we can anchor ourselves in integrity and love, and then stewarding that kind of fundamental humanity as we understand ourselves, understanding another, is a really powerful thing. So I'll pause there. Janet, anything that you want to kind of include in this kind of conversation of soul?
Yeah, well, I'm finding myself listening to you and imagining that there might be some watchers or listeners who are feeling this felt sense of like, wow, this feels right, this feels good, but how does that even work in an engineering offsite? How does that even remotely connect? So I guess I want to ask you, in the spirit of kind of grounding this for anyone who might be listening or watching, how do you see, because you've worked with many leaders and many teams over many years, how do you see this applicable, not for the wise, enlightened leader? That's another piece that I've been reflecting on too, is, I was hearing you say, when a leader is this, you can feel it. And I was thinking, how many leaders have I encountered in my career or life on the earth that are like that? Not that many. And that's partly why we do what we do, which is to help bring about the evolution of leadership, the evolution of business. Like, imagine a world. If John Lennon were here, we could ask him to write new lyrics for this song, right? Like, imagine a world where world leaders, global leaders, financial leaders, education, religious, business leaders had this quality of both soulfulness, spirit, integration, because there's plenty of people who hold power who arguably aren't that evolved or developed on these dimensions. So my question for you is, what advice would you give, or are there stories or examples that you could give of how the